Joining me now here in studio, John King, CNN anchor of Inside Politics, who was covering the White House for CNN on 9/11. Mary Matalin, who was a counselor to Vice President Dick Cheney that horrible day. Farah Pandith, who worked for both Presidents Bush and Obama, working to improve relations with Muslims around the world. And Andy Card, former Chief of Staff to George W. Bush, who first told the then president about the attacks. And Mr. Card, first of all, thanks one and all for being here. I know this is a heavy day, and to have to talk about it in front of a lot of people is challenging, so thanks ahead of time for that. We've all seen the picture of you telling President Bush we're under attack. I guess one thing I'm really curious in knowing is what it felt like to be delivering that message.
I knew the message I was delivering was a very rare message to deliver to a president. I knew he was in a setting that was a very rare setting to hear a message like that. But I did think about the words that I would say. He did know, or he had been told, that it appears a small twin-engine prop plane crashed into one of the towers at the World Trade Center in New York City. That's what I knew that he knew before he walked into that classroom. I was then told it wasn't a small twin-engine prop plane, it was a commercial jetliner. And then, oh my gosh, another plane hit the other tower at the World Trade Center. I stood at the door, I passed a test that chiefs of staff have all the time. Does the president need to know? Obviously, yes. I made a decision to pass on 2 facts and make 1 obvious editorial comment. And when it was appropriate, I said, a second plane hit the second tower, America is under attack. I knew that those words were something the president did not want to hear, but I also knew that he was the president and he would be thinking about his obligation to preserve, protect, and defend, and the responsibility was his. And he could not meet that responsibility without other people keeping their oaths of office to follow the command of the commander-in-chief. So I knew he was recognizing the responsibility and accepting the phenomenal burden to protect us.
Right now on the right side of your screen, you're seeing the 9/11 memorial ceremony at Ground Zero, and that flag, of course, is the one that had been recovered from Ground Zero, and it is being treated with a great deal of reverence right now, as you can see. Mary, let me go to you. You were with Vice President Cheney that day. He was at the White House, and he immediately had to go to a location and try to figure out what was going on.
Well, he didn't immediately have to go. He was immediately picked up and carried out.
Right.
And listening to Andy recount the calmness and the ability with which he delivered that message to the president reminds me, gives me a flashback to that day of feeling not scared but comforted that we had a chief of staff who would, that is very difficult what he just described so calmly, and a vice president and a president who knew how to work together, and a SecDef and a Secretary of State and all these, all the chain of command had previous experience with each other. And it was comforting because, as we'll certainly recount today, there is a fog of war. That's a real thing. As John will tell you, he was there.
And John, you were at the White House. I remember I went down to the mall because there were all these reports. Nobody knew what was going on, and there was a report that the mall was on fire. It was actually obviously the Pentagon. And as I was riding my bike back, a policeman ran over to me and said, "Get out of here. The 4th plane, or a plane, is headed for the White House." And you were there.
Right. So I think Secretary Johnson put it just perfectly. Your mind could not believe what your eyes were seeing, or your mind could not believe the questions you were having to ask and deal with throughout that day. I was arriving at the White House. I was a little late for work that day. It was a beautiful morning. It was this crisp, clear, spectacular September morning, and I was coming through the gates at the North Lawn when the Secret Service was starting to shut the building down. And they only let me through because of my experience, and they knew me, and I said, I have to go talk to my people. And I remember vividly, you forget so much when you do something for a long time, the young staffers running out. The Secret Service was screaming, get out, because they thought the plane, run for your life. They thought the plane was coming for the White House. And some of the young women who worked in the administration, just because of the shoes they were wearing, running out of their shoes. Their shoes were staying on the path as they were running into Lafayette Park. And we thought the plane was coming for the White House. And then I remember after a short time, you could see the smoke starting to rise. If you look down from the White House, from Lafayette Park, you have the White House here, and you could see the smoke coming up, and then you're starting to get messages that that was the Pentagon.
Let's take a moment and listen to this. you might recall, was recovered in the ashes of the Twin Towers. It was stitched together. It now lives at the 9/11 Memorial. We are anticipating a moment of silence in about 30 seconds. That moment will commemorate the first plane, American Airlines Flight 11, traveling from Boston to Los Angeles, striking the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Bells will toll throughout the city of New York as we remember the 2,977 people killed in New York City, Washington, D.C., and in a field outside Shanksville, Pennsylvania.
Good morning. My name is Jerry Diamadeo. My dad, Vincent Diamadeo, worked in the North Tower. Remembering back to the horrible day 15 years ago that changed my life. I was 10 years old. My brothers were 8, 7, and 5. Today I'm proud to be here to memorialize my father. This is a place that gives me a chance to think about beautiful memories, like Christmas Eve when Dad took my brothers and I to work to give my mom a break. On 9/11, the nation came together. People really tried to help us. I spent endless summers at a camp for kids who lost family members on 9/11. The
beginning of the ceremony commemorating the victims of 9/11, all 2,977, has begun. After that first moment of silence, I want to bring in my panel for 1 second. And Farah Pandith, you were in Boston the day of 9/11, that horrible day, one of the planes obviously leaving from Boston, American Airlines Flight 11, which we just commemorated. You saw that day as something of a call to service.
It was a call to service. I remember I was in One Financial Center, which if you look out the windows, you can see Logan Airport. And I remember looking out in that beautiful blue sky and thinking, as I looked at the airport, we were trying to get news in, and thinking, we had just heard about a terrorist organization. We weren't quite sure what was going on. And I remember thinking that if this group uses the name of Islam in any way, I just remember this sinking feeling. But I walked into my boss's office and I said, I'm an American and I'm a proud Muslim, and you can be both, and I need to serve. It was my call to action. It's how I came to Washington.
And I'm back with my panel and Andy Card, former Chief of Staff for President George W. Bush. When you heard about the Pentagon being hit, that meant this was a multi-city attack and was maybe not even done. You were on Air Force One with President Bush at the time?
Well, it continued the fog of war. I remember we were in the limousine driving from the school in Sarasota to Air Force One, and the president and I were sitting in the back of the limousine, and he's frustrated because he's trying to reach Secretary Rumsfeld. And I'm on my cell phone calling back to D.C., and he said, I can't get through to the Pentagon. And it turns out that's when the Pentagon had been hit. We didn't even know it had been hit. And so he was just frustrated that he couldn't get Secretary Rumsfeld. And then we get on the plane, we find out about the Pentagon being hit, and it told us that this was not just an attack on New York City, this was going to war, this was a real war, and that the fog of war was real. We weren't getting good information as quickly as we wanted to get it. And the president, I was very impressed, immediately started thinking about the greater burdens. It wasn't, tunnel vision. He had terrific peripheral vision about what was happening. And he was the one who said, I want to track down President Putin and call him and make sure he knows we're not going to war and that we don't want them to use it as an excuse to go to war with us.
Because because President Bush was going to raise the military threat level as to what was going on.
It was being raised literally as we were speaking. And yes, but he was just saying, there's a big consequence here if people miscalculate.
And Farah, you were talking about how President Bush, to his credit, was thinking about other ramifications after the attack.
So this is about a violent ideology that continues to manifest, and it's not just about one attack here in America. And as we've seen over the course of the last 15 years, whether it's attacks in London or Madrid, whether it is in Belgium or Paris and Boston, it's a global threat. And over the course of the years after 9/11, you began to see a change in how we thought about the ideological war and the impact. And I think it's very important to understand that AQ was, we could imagine it then as something that we think we understood, but we didn't have the imagination to see the events that were going to take place afterwards. So you have the manifestations in different parts of the world. You have groups now like ISIS. You have other groups that are, rallied to the call of an us and them. All of these things were put in place in the years after, but what was happening during the Bush administration was, how do we think about the recruitment process? How do we look at the ideological war? We weren't afraid to look at it then, and we shouldn't be afraid to look at it now. The impact of how this ideology has manifested. I remember talking to somebody in Tanzania when I was the special representative to Muslim communities in the Obama administration. This is a man who had been through the attacks in 1998 when Al-Qaeda attacked the embassy attacks in Tanzania, and he said to me, doesn't your country understand that this ideology just isn't about what happened in 98 or what happened in 2001, that we're seeing this all over the world? Are you preparing for that? And that really struck me. And I think we have to, this is such a sobering day. This is a day of remembrance. And we have to really think about where we want to be 15 years from now and what we're doing to make sure that that ideology does not recruit more children from around the world.
And Mary Madeline, when George W. Bush, President Bush, went to the mosque on Massachusetts Avenue here and said Islam is peace, that was mocked by a lot of conservatives in retrospect as being politically correct and being squishy. But really, it was about exactly what Farad's talking about, strategy, not wanting more attacks.
Right, but there was a tension in saying Islam is a religion of peace. Vice President we all had Senate speeches around, Andy's office would put it in, and he'd take it out every time, because whether or not that is generally true, Islamic extremists that we're talking about, this is not a mission of peace. And there was a lot of crash courses. The Vice President knew who it was. Only a couple of days before that, Mossad the Lion had been murdered in a cave in Afghanistan, and the Bamiyan statues had gone down and what. So there was a familiarity there. But for the rest of us, we brought in Bernard Lewis, we brought in military strategists. I dare say an infinitesimal percent of Americans knew what a caliphate was at the time.
Absolutely.
It was a very big learning experience. And it wasn't that we had an immediate ideological problem with conservatives or how we think of politics today. It was, how do we go after this threat? And we weren't as concerned. We didn't need to be concerned because there wasn't a politicization of identity politics at the time.
But there was a battlefield war that we were standing up, and there was an ideological war that we were preparing ourselves for. And the separation of both of them is something that we have to really be thinking about, Jake, as we think through what we need to be doing next. And I don't think we have stood up the ideological component as fiercely as we really should have and could have. And when I think about what Mary just said about trying to make sure that we were the greatest strength of our country is the diversity. The greatest strength, by the way, vis-a-vis Muslims is that we are the most diverse group of Muslims anywhere in the world. And we were standing by the values of our Constitution, who we are as Americans, and bringing the country together. And I think we really need to be doing that again.
And the very challenging thing also to cover, John, on 9/11, because it was One side wanted this to be a clash of civilizations. Al-Qaeda, an Islamist terrorist group, wanted this to be a clash of civilizations, while President Bush and his White House and administration didn't want to give them the benefit of that being the narrative.
Right, and we have this conversation about sort of the domino effects, everything changed on 9/11, and we're still dealing with some of those issues front and center 15 years later, but so much else changed. I remember it was midway through the day when we first started to reestablish communications with sources. Remember, everybody was in the crisis mode when the planes were hitting, and then everybody was moving around. They went to a Presidential Emergency Operations Center, the PEOC, down below the White House. There was not a lot of great communications. I remember finally, middle of the day, when I finally got through to an intelligence source, so I deeply trust, who said this is just unmistakable. This is bin Laden, Al-Qaeda. It's just, there's no other organization that can project at this level. And you started to have those conversations. And remember, as we talk about the after moments, just to come back to the day a little bit, it was a bit later we learned, Mary was down with the vice president. And again, we were asking questions about sort of who's in charge, who's calling the shots minute by minute. It's a remarkable thing. Who's in charge of the United States government in the middle of a terrorist attack? And we learned that the vice president had authorized the shoot-down orders. Remember?
At the president's orders.
At the president's orders.
Okay.
I'm not saying it was the vice president. I just mean that they're in a conversation beneath the White House and they're having about shooting down planes in the sky. And Norm Mineta was the transportation secretary, grounding all the planes. I'm not taking issue with who issued the orders. I just mean that the things that were happening on that day when the transportation secretary says get everything out of the sky. The administration, the president, and the vice president authorized shooting down airplanes. It was just a day that was. Again, as Secretary Johnson said in your interview,
one of the planes was George Herbert Walker Bush, wasn't it? So that was, that's why I started with the point that I did. The seamlessness in the fog of war with which these men who had previously worked together and had defense experience, it was, I'm not being a partisan when I say I cannot think of another team that knew what to do automatically. The vice president knew automatically which were the president's calls to make and which he had to make immediately. This is not common. May rest in peace, Al Haig, when President Reagan said, I'm in charge. There was none of that. It was everybody knew what their roles were.
And Mary Madeline, we were just talking about the allusion that President Obama made to the man with the red bandana. That's a story about a man named Wells Crowther, who saved the lives of a number of his colleagues with a red bandana that he used to shelter their faces from the smoke. He was later found dead, and his family pieced together who it was.
His daddy gave him a handkerchief when he was little, one for his pocket, a white one, and one for his back pocket, the red bandana, one for show, one for blow. And he always said, see this bandana, I'm going to change the world with this bandana. And he was covering his own face, going up and down the stairs, taking people downstairs who were in shock and were so injured. And Peggy Noonan wrote, as she always does, a remarkable column. And it puts me in mind of what we've been discussing about the particular poignancy of this 15 years. Our kids were little. My kids were next door to the Pentagon. Those girls are now, one's starting college, one's graduating college. 15 years is an entire generation. The millennials now outnumber the baby boomers, and they've grown up not being jaded about this, but they have an entirely different perspective about it. There is a poignancy about these lives living through this different, what is it, a new normalcy. And that mom who said, when Peggy said, well, how did you make this hero? She said, honesty and integrity, and he wanted to do his part, and he went back, and she felt the force of him behind her after they knew he'd perished. Said, I'm okay. I did the right thing.
It's a remarkable story. Peggy Noonan wrote it for the Wall Street Journal. It is amazing, Andy Card, former chief of staff for President Bush, that there are people now fighting and dying for this country who have no memories of 9/11. My children have never heard of 9/11. They're too little to know about it yet. And yet they're growing up in a nation and in a world irrevocably shaped by it.
Well, the world did change. Of course, people who weren't born on 9/11 don't know the world changed, but the world did change. And it's important for those of us who recognized what happened and the need for change, and that it's a continuing challenge. This is not just yesterday, it's also today, and it'll unfortunately be tomorrow. But for me, there was a moment that became very convicting. And it was as the president had finished a long day in New York City, where he stood beside a firefighter and told the world they would hear us. And he met with the families of policemen and firemen that were missing down at Ground Zero. And when he walked into the room, and he came in an unexpected way, he just walked into the room. It wasn't like they announced the president walking into the room. And there was tremendous hope. My husband will make it. My son is going to be okay. My daughter knows what to do. There was tremendous fear. There was anger. There were tears. There were prayers. But as he's getting ready to leave that group, I remember he walks by a woman who happened to be one of the first people he greeted when he walked into the room. But she stood up, and she was not very tall, and she looked up at the president in his eyes, and she held out her hand, and she said, "I want you to have this. This is my son's badge. His name is George Howard. Don't ever forget him." And she dropped the badge in the president's hand, and everybody has tears streaming down their cheeks. And I'll never forget what the president said. He said, "Mrs. Howard, America will forget. They'll start to move on. But you don't have to worry about me. I will never forget George Howard." That's why we're here today, because we all promised we'd never forget. That badge, badge number 1012, President Bush carried with him the entire rest of his presidency. And even today, he doesn't forget George Howard.
President and Mrs. Bush will attend church services in Dallas today and participate in private prayer and remembrance, and he'll head out to the Dallas Cowboys home opener against the New York Giants and do some memorializing there as well. And John, it was interesting to try to watch the country go back to normal after 9/11. I remember the World Series being a particularly
The pitch.
the pitch. As I recall, it was it the Yankees versus the Diamondbacks? I forget.
Arizona
exactly.
Diamondbacks.
Yeah, and getting back to normal while also not forgetting a big challenge.
Yeah, the term new normal became, the vice president used it in a speech once, I remember at the time, and it just became the new normal. And to the point you were making about your kids, they live in a world, and we cover a world, and we do business in a world that is forever changed. And sometimes you see it. Every day I see something that reminds me of 9/11. It's either very different or very the same, or you remember a moment. We don't, airport security, our access to public officials. You used to be able to walk through the West Wing of the White House, a building we both covered. You used to be able to walk in and go past the Oval Office on your way to see somebody. Some of this security is necessary. Some things, of course, were overdone. Culturally, to the point about younger people, the diversity and tolerance, it's instinctive to them. And older people, we have what you were talking about, whether it's distrust of Muslims or distrust of each other or political partisanship. Remember the first few weeks and months, the country was as united as I could remember in my years covering politics, and then that disintegrated. And Barack Obama, who just spoke at that ceremony, would not be president of the United States were it not for the Iraq War. The Iraq War would not have happened were it not for 9/11. So we can peel this onion in so many ways, politically, culturally, societally, and it's just, it changed. Think of how it changed the Bush presidency. I will be the president of this hemisphere. I will do comprehensive immigration reform. I will do immigration reform. Instead, he became, as he himself called himself, a wartime president. It changed, and the Republican Party today is in a very different place, still in turmoil because of the issues that started that day.